Our top story is about this as markets shed trillions of dollars with more volatility today over the tariffs. And also this, these massive protests against Trump over the weekend, hundreds of thousands, the largest single day of coordinated action against Trump in this young second term. Wall Street trading and grassroots protests may seem like very different lanes. And yet they both reflect, when you think about it, the views of very large groups, both rejecting this Trump agenda, having seen it play out in reality across these 75 days or so. The $6 trillion market slide is a clear rejection of Trump's economic and tariff plans. The protests reflect opposition to a much wider set of policies, including maybe economics, but also clearly from listening and watching and covering these protests to immigration, to slashing government, to lawless acts. And public opinion shows many people oppose Trump's actions and governing approach in this rocky beginning of the second term. We're tracking all of these forms of opposition tonight. And I'm going to walk through with you right now the evidence, what we have, what we're seeing, about how this could actually reshape this young presidency. How these lanes of very different groups of people all speaking, though, towards one direction, towards trying to combat what Trump is doing, to stop or change some of his actions, to see, can he really get away with this, like this, for this long? This could all catalyze even more powerful pushback. It's been, in that vein, another wild day on Wall Street to start the week. Trump on defense over the flagging trade war, which is hurting America more than it's helping America. There's no real disagreement about that fact. And there are concerns tonight the worst could still be yet to come. The tariff failure risking a full-blown recession.
Markets have been extremely volatile all morning, plunging, surging, and then tumbling again.
Asian and European markets are also reeling from the Trump tariff. Stocks in Hong Kong had their biggest one-day drop in nearly 3 decades.
Trump's trade war wiping trillions of dollars in value from these markets. It's been extraordinary. It's been volatile. It's changing by the minute.
Where will we go today? Right from the get-go, we're going down. We're off 1,090 points.
The methodology that was used has been universally derided as being non-serious.
Economic Armageddon. You're not feeling too good about anything, are you?
The dumping of so many American stocks reflects what I mentioned, the combined views of many investors rejecting Trump's economic actions. Even some normally pro-Republican CEOs now warning this is the Trump recession, given his policies that are driving rising prices, inflation, and what could become massive job losses in America when companies lose this much value. The Trump slump is $6 trillion lost and counting just in the last week. It's hard to get your head around these numbers. Today, we saw wild volatility in some of the markets responding to both real evidence-based fears, seeing what's happening and how it could get worse, as well as all kinds of rumors, which had the stock sort of spiking briefly and falling again. But I'm going to walk through exactly what we know here after the closing bell. The value of the largest 500 companies is down over 10% in 3 trading days, volatile, and then closing today similar to Friday's drop, you can see there. The Dow down 10% across those 3 trading days. It fell another point today. Markets are not the entire economy. But these kind of massive swings, giant swings, you say, oh, we're going 4, 5, 6 trillion. You get up to 7 trillion, it doesn't fit in the box. We're well past a correction, and we're into larger risks. These are the kind of swings that do drive the real economy. The experts say recession far more likely because of Trump's actions. That risk rising to 45%, according to the insider bank Goldman Sachs. Other estimates have it even higher, going more likely than not. And Trump is driving concerns to continue. He's warning of more tariffs on China to start the week, as many countries work on their own retaliation plans that will target the American consumer. Now, this rejection of Trump's policy is so broad, it's actually hard right now to find public defenders for what he's doing on Wall Street. I mean, he has employees, of course. He has paid spokespersons. They have to defend Trump or get fired. But if you broaden out to even his most loyal sort of partisan business allies, some of whom obviously float above the rules of a normal employee, even they're pushing back. Elon Musk losing many billions right now, and he's publicly opposing Trump's tariffs, saying Europe and the U.S. should actually move in the opposite direction, ideally to, quote, a zero tariff situation, a free trade zone between Europe and North America. He adds, that has certainly been my advice to the president. Or take a very vocal MAGA Wall Street titan, Bill Ackman. You may recognize him a bit or know his name. When you look at those Wall Street hedge fund and big sort of masters of the universe, to use the old novelistic phrase, he's been really atop them in the recent era, last year or two, as the MAGA guy. And he recently specifically endorsed Trump's economic plans after the election.
We're stepping into, I would say, the most pro-growth, pro-American administration I've perhaps seen in my adult lifetime, certainly. I would say everyone is incredibly enthusiastic, really about a new administration that's about efficiency, removing the impediments to growth, deregulation. President Trump will do nothing that interferes with the success of the country, the success of the economy.
Quite the embrace. Now Ackman says Trump is making the ultimate blunder for the success of the country and the economy, self-inducing what he calls the economic equivalent of a nuke, blaming Trump for a, quote, self-induced economic nuclear winter. Trump policies destroying confidence in our country as a trading partner, as a place to do business. Now, that billionaire's analogy might sound a bit extreme, equating these costs with the death toll of nuclear war, but his point is that Trump's policy here is so obviously bad on the evidence, on what we know about economics and the foreseeable results of the $6 trillion we just lost, that it's so extreme and dangerous it could hurt hundreds of millions of people for years, not a month or two, for years. Now, economists agree on that point if Trump is stubborn and ignores the reality and costs and presses on with this. Some of it, even if he presses on and then tries to dial it back, will not be easily reversed. Again, Ackman saying this will, the nuclear winter, as he calls it, take potentially years or decades to rehabilitate, potentially decades to rehabilitate. That's a lot of economic pain. Most of it hits working people the hardest. They have the leanest savings or no savings or live on debt, so they can't just afford a recession and live on like normal. And I want to show you tonight, right now, I mentioned we're going to go through the multiple lanes, and I'm going to get to those national protests, which are significant and are a different metric for what we're seeing across all the measurable ways Americans are perceiving this. But before I go any further, I just want to point out this nuclear winter concern is a long ways from Mr. Ackman's Trump guarantee that I showed you that was just 116 days ago.
President Trump will do nothing that interferes with the success of the country, the success of the economy.
It's a long ways from saying Trump will do nothing that interferes with the success of the American economy to what Mr. Ackman now updates as, his words, the risk of a nuclear winter. Now, that's just from Trump's boosters, and many thought they'd be getting richer, or at least do no harm, a, quote, pro-business administration. But like so many other people who listen to Trump's words without really understanding what's happening, even the very smart and the very rich, they now have buyer's remorse. So we have this broad, stark rejection of Trumpism from his own allies, from the Wall Street bankers, and from the CEOs who are actually living through the first waves of this, which may not be the last. Then, as I mentioned to you, there are the millions of Americans who didn't choose this to begin with, who didn't believe everything Trump said or think that someone who promises you a better economy, along with the other things we know about him, was going to give you a better economy. There are people living with the consequences regardless of how they voted, and many people don't vote but are living through this. And while the market reaction is confined to economics, Wall Street has a one-track mind, and under law, business leaders have a legal duty, by the way, to put money above everything else in how they invest or run a company. So investors and hedge funds they're dropping out of American stocks because of what Trump is doing, undercutting the value of those stocks. Then the broader Trump rejection is by these other huge, massive groups of people. This weekend's protests saw what that looks like. People, even amongst all this tumult and all the other issues going on in their own lives and obligations and jobs, taking time for massive gatherings like you see here in Boston, huge crowds in New York, showing an energy that could be tapped for any number of political movements. Doesn't need to be partisan, doesn't need to be democratic, by the way. It might just be a people's movement against some of these excesses that apparently now the protesters and the bankers agree on. This rebuts some of the Washington talk we've heard about a resistance that is over or tired. And while some could dismiss even these large crowds as confined to liberal or East Coast areas, the protests, we can report, hit every state. Here are some of the enormous crowds we saw in Colorado and in cities all over the country: Minneapolis, Oklahoma, Davenport, South Dakota, with many pretty informed people this weekend speaking out.
When they come for one of us, they come for all of us.
I vote for Trump and is not what I vote for.
The Republican Party in this country has to get a backbone and stand up to get Trump.
Trump got elected, all our savings are gone.
He wants to step into our Social Security check and all these things is not nice.
We're in a world of hurt right now as a country. Everybody's got to stand up.
Do whatever we need to do to make sure that we can keep our democracy.
Breaking in just the last few hours, the U.S. Supreme Court has temporarily blocked a federal judge's order to return a Maryland man without protected legal status, who the administration had conceded was mistakenly deported to an El Salvador mega security prison. Gilmar Abrego Garcia legal team has already responded tonight to the Supreme Court, in part writing the government's contention that courts lack jurisdiction to order it to return an individual wrongfully removed in defiance of a court order is unconscionable. As Judge Wilkinson noted in his concurrence this morning, this is a path of perfect lawlessness, one that courts cannot condone. Also breaking in the last hour, the Supreme Court has handed Trump another significant victory, lifting the court order blocking the administration from using the Wartime Alien Enemies Act to rapidly deport Venezuelan migrants. Joining me now is Veronica Cardenas, former Assistant Chief Counsel from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Veronica, let's take these in order so we can get a clearer picture of what has happened. Starting first with Mr. Garcia's case, the Maryland man who the administration has admitted, oops, our bad, didn't mean to take him, but nope, can't get him back. And so the efforts to get him back has now been stayed by the Supreme Court. What does that mean?
So I think, and I want to make one thing clear, that this is going to be a battle between the courts and what the executive authority has the ability to do. And this was Chief Justice John Roberts. It's still very early to tell how this issue will play out. But essentially what this does is it really takes away authority from the immigration courts, who have already heard this issue. The executive branch is saying that this person was an MS-13 gang member, and thereby he is a foreign terrorist organization, which this administration had deemed so February 20th of 2025. But this person was someone who already went before an immigration judge. He had his trial. The government already tried to make those arguments. The lower court and the administrative court found that they were vague and uncorroborated. And now we have the Chief Justice John Roberts and his decision stating that the executive branch has the authority to not only label somebody, but then to wrongfully deport them to the country where they were not supposed to.
That's the part, that part right there. I don't understand. There is no evidence. There's been no evidence of criminal behavior or activity that's been presented in any court along in this process. So I'm a little bit confused how the Supreme Court can look at this line of arguments that have been made by Mr. Garcia's lawyers, saying, show us where this guy is a Venezuelan thug, show us where he's committed to, where he's been a threat to the U.S., show us where he's violated American law. And the only thing they've got going for them is the fact that, well, we already snatched him up and took him over there to El Salvador. Right. And the Supreme Court is like, well, that's okay. You can do that.
Right.
What?
And that's what makes this so dangerous, because the government is admitting their error. There are ways to bring people back if they are wrongfully deported. The prior administrations have done that. This is not anything new. What's new is that this administration is trying to pull their weight, saying that the courts, the federal courts, have no authority over executive authority. And so it looks like, at least by what I got from Chief Justice John Roberts' decision, is that this is for Congress to decide. And that is just not the case. The courts, the federal courts, are put into place for this very reason. And the government admitting that he was unlawfully removed is just, and then on top of that, for things to go in their favor, at least for now, this is a temporary stay. It's just absurd.
All right, so let's shift to the decision this evening regarding the use of the Alien Enemies Act, now clearing the way for this president, Donald Trump, to indiscriminately, randomly just grab people, claim they're Venezuelans, and send them to El Salvador or wherever he wants to send them, under the guise that I guess the Supreme Court thinks we're at war with Venezuela. I don't get the order, the nature of the order, but help us understand what this means.
I think this order really comes as a disappointment, because it seems like this administration is given the pass to just label people the way they want to in order to make good on their promise of removing people in the United States. So we will have to see how this plays out, but in my opinion, this administration is creating and carving out new classes of removable non-citizens, people that Congress never intended to create.
Donald Trump is doing his very best to play it cool right now. He wants you to believe, he wants all of us to believe, that he has everything under control, even things that are very much out of control. His behavior kind of reminds me a bit of an arsonist who's pretending there is no fire, when he's the guy who threw the match and lit the actual fire. I mean, his actions caused the market to plummet. His actions have caused people to worry about their retirement savings and how much everything is going to cost. Of course they are. And he's doing everything possible to pretend like none of that is happening, like there is no fire at all. I mean, the guy took a long weekend. Good for him, I guess. Spending time at 2 different resorts he owns in Florida. He appeared at a Saudi-backed Live golf tournament, and he played some golf of his own. He even posted a video of himself golfing on social media, as if to make absolutely certain we all knew where he was and what he was doing. There he is. That's the video. Nothing to be concerned about, everyone. I am so relaxed while the market tanks that I am playing golf and hanging with my Saudi buddies. A White House official described the optics of a president hitting the links while the economy was in free fall as, quote, going to a birthday party after a friend has surgery. A little weird, but that is one way to put it, certainly. Then this morning, Donald Trump's message to the American people was telling them not to be weak, not to be stupid. We got this, America. Don't be wussies. And it's not even just him. I mean, his fellow arsonists, whether they knew it or not, had a pretty clear message for the American people this weekend when they were out on Sunday talk shows. Let them eat cake. Here's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
What is your message to Americans who want to retire right now and who've just seen their lifetime savings drop significantly?
Well, Kristen, I think that's a false narrative. Americans who want to retire right now, the Americans who have put away for years in their savings accounts, I think they don't look at the day-to-day fluctuations of what's happening.
No one is looking at the day-to-day fluctuations of their savings account, says uber-rich Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And honestly, he sounds a little bit like he was prepped by the same communications staffer, maybe he was, who's been advising his colleague, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
Let's say Social Security didn't send out their checks this month. My mother-in-law, who's 94, she wouldn't call and complain. She just wouldn't. She'd think something got messed up, and she'll get it next month.
Yeah.
A fraudster always makes the loudest noise, screaming, yelling, and complaining.
There really is nothing like a couple of billionaires who are pretty out of touch really speaking to the fears of the American public, is there? But But as Donald Trump plays golf and tweets through it and sends out guys like Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick to pretend like they relate to working people living paycheck to paycheck, it's important for you to know that these guys are kind of on a bit of an island right now. I mean, for one thing, even their fellow billionaires are freaked, for good reason. Bill Ackman, who was a big Trump backer in 2024, lashed out at the Trump administration on Twitter last night. He accused Howard Lutnick of having a conflict of interest and wanting to profit off a tanking economy. He also said that these tariffs are sending us toward a self-induced economic nuclear winter. That from a guy who just a few months ago was saying the business community was giddy with excitement about the Donald Trump administration and that growth was about to explode. That one didn't really age so well, did it, Bill Ackman? Now, as for Larry Fink, who's the CEO of the world's largest money manager, BlackRock, he said today that his fellow CEOs believe we're already in a recession. And Mark Cuban, not exactly a Trump supporter, I know, but he's a legit billionaire and someone who calls it like he sees it. And he said that if the new tariffs stay in place for multiple years and are enforced and inflationary and DOJ continues to cut and fire, we will be in a far worse situation than 2008. Worse than 2008 is very, very bad, to state perhaps the very obvious. And even the cable news channel that Donald Trump watches all day long is starting to come to terms with the reality of the situation, it seems.
It is going to have an effect on Main Street. Some things will become higher priced. We will see some products actually be raised in price because companies will pass on the cost of tariffs to consumers. I would expect that. That's why you have some people saying that we could see a recession, we'll see a growth slowdown.
I mean, guys, when you've lost Maria Bartiromo, maybe you've got a bit of a problem. So pressure is building. Of course it is. Now, I'll concede that most Americans don't necessarily relate to everything Bill Ackman says or what Larry Fink says or what Maria Bartiromo thinks. But they might care about what they hear on their local news broadcasts. And what they all are talking about right now in local news broadcasts is the potential impact of these tariffs on small businesses.
The tariff roller coaster is especially challenging for small businesses.
Clothing retailers and local businesses expect to be impacted.
They know that tariffs will eventually impact their bottom line.
They're already feeling the financial pain from these tariffs.
For a specialty store, it's going to be harder for us to get these unique and interesting products because our suppliers just aren't carrying them anymore.
With the amount of product that we import, it would probably cost us $50,000 to $100,000 additional per year. That's not just something that a small business can necessarily just absorb.
This tin, my distributor already did a preemptive price raise of 7%. So I'm concerned about what a 25% tariff will do.
Now a T-shirt that, it used to be maybe $10 to make is now $15, $20 to make.
I've already seen a rise in some of those products in preparation of the tariffs hitting sooner than later.
Adding these tariffs on top of things and making it a little bit more expensive to buy, that's definitely not what we want.
See, each and every day this continues, it gets a little more real for everyone. We just heard from a lot of people that it's feeling very real for. Sure, they see the headlines about the stock market falling off a cliff. Those are very concerning. When things start to cost more, when people do check their 401ks, which I think a lot of people do, an already scary situation starts to get much scarier. And when things start to get more real for the American people, things start to get more real for the people they send to Washington. And that's really actually how it's supposed to work. Now, do Republicans in Congress all care about rising costs and retirement accounts of their constituents getting wiped out? It's my sincere hope that many of them do. But what they definitely care about is keeping their jobs. That I know for sure. And that is one of the reasons why a bill in the Senate to curb Donald Trump's power on tariffs now has 7, count them 7, you can see them all on the screen, Republican co-sponsors. Now, this bill would require that new tariffs sunset after 60 days unless Congress passes a joint resolution approving them, which they probably wouldn't do. And 7 Republicans are saying very loudly and clearly that that is a good idea. I should point out that 2 of the Republicans on that list, Tom Tillis and Susan Collins, are the 2 most vulnerable Republicans, or 2 of them, up for re-election in 2026. Again, hopefully they care about what's happening to the people they represent. That's why people send them to Congress. But they definitely care about keeping their jobs. And for Mike Johnson, a little note for you, Republicans in the House also care about keeping their jobs too. It's not just the Senate. And yet, Mike Johnson was so afraid of pushing back on Trump over tariffs that he literally gave up the power to rein him in. Last month, at the height of the government shutdown fight, Johnson snuck in a vote where House Republicans basically gave away their ability to cancel the Trump tariffs. But now there are some Republicans in the House who want that power back. Of course they do. And some who at least want a little bit more clarity from the White House on what their actual plan is. During a House Republican conference call yesterday, Republican Congressman Darrell Issa asked if lawmakers could receive a detailed briefing from the White House about Trump's tariffs. As if to say, hey, if you guys are going to tank the economy, can you at least tell us why? What's the plan here? Congressman French Hill, who is also the chairman of the House Financial Relations Committee, said that the Trump administration has been great to work with on a whole host of issues, okay, but he's been frustrated when it comes to how the White House has operated on tariffs. You think? And one Republican in the House, Don Bacon, has said he will introduce a bill in the House that would limit Trump's ability to impose tariffs without the backing of Congress, just like the one in the Senate. So, could this move forward? Could Republicans show a spine and vote with Democrats to stop the tariffs? Some of them are showing a bit of a spine. But I'm not holding my breath because they need many more votes than that. But the point is the pressure is building. And Trump is worried enough that he actually issued a formal veto threat today about a bill, by the way, that is not yet scheduled to be voted on and does not yet have the votes to pass. But he was scared enough about what's happening in Congress right now, about the pushback he's seeing and feeling out there, that he said he'll veto a bill if it ever gets to him. But again, if Mike Johnson has his way, no tariff bill will ever get to Donald Trump's desk. It has to pass the Senate and the House, of course. On that same conference call yesterday, Johnson said Republicans should hold the line and trust Donald Trump's instincts. Don't trust the markets. Don't trust the smartest economic minds in the country who aren't all partisan. Don't trust pissed off constituents, of which there are many. Just trust Donald Trump's instincts. And then today, Mike Johnson basically repeated as much when he was being chased by reporters through the halls of the Capitol today.
I think you got to give the president the latitude, the runway to do what it is he was elected to do.
Now, what he was elected to do, if I remember correctly here, and forgive me because maybe my memory is a little foggy, I thought Donald Trump was elected to lower the cost of living for everyone, not raise the price of everything, and tank the American economy. But that seems to be what he is intending to do. And while he's on his little island over there with Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent and Mike Johnson, the cracks are showing and the pressure is building. It's building from the billionaire class even, and from conservative media and Republicans in both chambers of Congress. And it's definitely building among the American people. If those massive protests across the country on Saturday taught us anything, and we're going to talk about those in the show too, is that Americans are paying attention to what is happening in Washington right now and how it is impacting them. They're paying attention to what these guys are doing to our system of government and to our economy and to our way of life. And trust me, the American people are taking a note of who's blindly trusting Donald Trump's instincts right now and who is based in reality.
So let's get right to it with NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans, Justin Wolfers, professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, and Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason. Christine, I'd like to start with you. What are we seeing with the markets right now? There was this crazy blip earlier this morning when it sounded like there was a rumor that these tariffs might be delayed. Did that go away? Just please tell us where we are.
It was so insane. I mean, that is an official technical market term. Look, I was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange when this happened. Suddenly you had like a huge rally in the stock market on talk. Everyone screaming that the president was going to pause these tariffs for 90 days, except for China. And we know from Bill Ackman, the billionaire who was a Trump supporter, he had told the president, he had said in a post, hey, the president should pause these things. Anyway, the whole thing turned into a rumor that ran through the internet and ran through the markets, and then suddenly was debunked and the market came down again. I think what it shows you is just how jumpy everyone is. It shows you just how concerned people are about every single whiff of news, even rumors about what's happening in the trade war. And it just shows you how important this trade war is to the future of the U.S. economy and the global economy. What you heard from Bill Ackman, he called for a nuclear winter in the economies around the world if these tariffs aren't taken off. So just a very, very jumpy, edgy, and just dread is the word I would use in the investment community right now.
I mean, it's so dire, Gabe. The president was asked specifically about whether or not he's trying to intentionally tank stocks. You know, he was golfing this weekend when this 10% tariff hit. Can you talk about the optics here?
Well, Christina, the White House really doesn't seem to care, at least not publicly. They are doubling down on all this. And just a short time ago, as you said, President Trump posting on social media that he is threatening a 50% tariff against China if they don't withdraw their retaliatory tariff. Now, look, yes, the president over the past few days spent a bunch of his time in his golf course in Florida, but I spoke with a White House official just this morning who stressed that he was still doing work, and they don't seem too bothered by some of the response they've been getting from even some Republicans who are worried about the effect that these tariffs will have on many Americans, on their retirement accounts. But the White House just sees this as something that needs to happen, as you just mentioned, that the president's saying that this is medicine. They've been running with that metaphor for the last several days, even as the Dow continues to drop there. And they really see this as a kind of rejiggering of the global economy and something that he is not backing off of, Christina.
Jeff, there's also been a bit of mixed messaging as to whether the purpose of this is to start a negotiation or whether these things are not negotiable. The White House says 50 countries have requested tariff talks, and Israel is going to be the first to negotiate in person today. Israel, who were reportedly offered to go to mutually zero tariffs. What do we expect out of that meeting?
Well, I think for sure that they're going to be talking about tariffs at that meeting. Obviously, there are a lot of other topics that will be coming up in a meeting between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel, not least of which the war in Gaza. But tariffs are at the top of the list for President Trump right now for all countries that he feels have treated the United States unfairly, and Israel is one of them, despite that close relationship, despite the fact that we've been allies for decades. But that same criteria applies to all of the countries that President Trump has imposed tariffs on, and he's keeping them on until or unless they reduce theirs. And you asked about deals and mixed messaging. There certainly has been some, but I think it is fair to assume, based on what the president has said, because let's remember it's his final word that matters at the end, that if other countries come and offer him a deal and he takes it and or negotiates it further, then that's something that President Donald Trump wants. He considers himself a deal maker, and he applies that to this as well.
And to that point, Justin, the president now says he's only going to negotiate if countries zero out the trade deficit. Let's take a listen.
They're dying to make a deal, but I said, we're not going to have deficits with your country. We're not going to do that, because to me a deficit is a loss. We put a big tariff on Europe. They are coming to the table. They want to talk, but there's no talk unless they pay us a lot of money on a yearly basis.
Justin, I will fully admit to getting a not nice grade in my grad school economics class, but is that how trade deficits work? Most of these are free economies. Can you make a top-down policy to instantly level out a trade deficit, or is that a more market-driven figure?
Not only can you not do it, you don't want to do it. This is someone who, Christina, I don't care how poorly you did in your graduate school economics. You still did better than this bloke. Look, here's the way to think about it. I have a trade deficit with Trader Joe's. I go to Trader Joe's once a week and I buy a bunch of stuff, so I'm buying stuff from them. And when I'm at Trader Joe's, I say to them, I'm here, I'm willing to sell you economics lectures, and for some reason they never buy anything from me. The question is, could I immediately remedy that trade deficit? The only way to do that would be by stopping buying anything from Trader Joe's altogether. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of how global trade works. And the terrifying thing is, this isn't just me coming to you. This is every economist in the United States, with the exception of one. That one is Peter Navarro, who turns out to be the convicted felon who's currently advising the president. What he needs to do is look outside the White House and get some advice from someone else, because this is pure destruction.
I also want to ask you, Justin, you said the pain is going to be 50 times worse than what Trump's first-term policies created. Is that hyperbolic? Do you really believe that? And how are we going to really fundamentally feel it change our lives here in the U.S.?
No, so that is a very literal estimate. The logic of this is, I'm not going to get into this part of it, which is the cost of a tariff rises with the square of a tariff. So small tariffs, small problems, Big tariffs, big squared problems. How does this play out for you and I? Well, next time you go to the grocery store, just pick a few things off the shelf and rather than checking out the price, check out where it came from. You'll discover that all of our lives are profoundly integrated with people all around the world. And even if it says made in America, it's probably made in America, often with ingredients or inputs from abroad. And then go to work and think about certainly your job, your work is being exported all around the world. And so what's going to happen is effectively President Trump is cutting you and I off from all of the glorious variety and richness that we get from engaging with the rest of the world.
And Gabe, you heard Justin talk about how it's been few and far between economists who think this is going to be a good idea. We're also starting to hear from business leaders, including, ironically, Elon Musk, who said over the weekend he wants free trade with the EU. There were big hands-off protests across the country this weekend. What typically happens when the president feels backed into a corner? Do we expect this to alter his behavior in one way or another?
Well, Christina, he typically lashes out. Not indication that he feels backed in a corner quite just yet, but you are right. Elon Musk, a top Trump advisor and huge ally of this administration, has now for the past several days been touting the benefits of free trade. And a senior White House official telling me earlier today that Elon is entitled to his own opinion. Now, you see the president right there. He is slamming his critics and slamming those Republicans that may be thinking about opposing him, telling him don't be weak, don't be stupid, don't be a panicking. Apparently combining panic and Republican there and coining a new term. But the president has repeatedly said that this is something that it's central not just to his political identity, Christina, but he keeps repeating that he has been talking about this for decades, even before he entered politics. So the White House, despite this chorus of criticism that we're hearing because of this market chaos, they at this point seem to stay the course. And they reiterated to me, despite that fluctuation earlier today with that rumor of some sort of 90-day pause in these tariffs, they are stressing that is not the case and that is simply incorrect. They are staying the course, at least for now. Christina.
Jeff, there's also talk the tariffs could lead to a $2,300 iPhone. What is that about?
Well, I think that's just one example of where inflation may manifest as a result of these higher prices. And I want to thank you for asking Justin the question you did earlier about the economics of tariffs, because he did a better job of taking that on than I could. But I think broadly, the answer to your question here is that prices are going to go up. And the iPhone, based on where it's made and where the parts come from, and the presence that it has in China is going to be impacted by these increasing tariffs on China. So that is a good example of a product that a lot of Americans use, and there are a bunch of other examples as well.
So, Christine, what can Americans do to keep their money safe? Are we at the put it in a shoebox under your bed phase, or are there other better options?
I like high-yield savings accounts. Shoebox, you don't get any return on that investment. But look, there are a lot of people running out trying to figure out where their cash is and if they have too much stocks and how close they are to retirement. You know, if you've got kids close to going to college or you're saving in a college savings fund, I totally get that anxiety. The Treasury Secretary told Kristen Welker that people close to retirement aren't looking at their 401ks day by day. My reporting would be show a different demographic, people who are very concerned here. So talk to a financial professional if you're close to retirement or you need to tap those 529 savings funds. And if you have cash, you know, make sure you're getting the biggest return on it that you can. If you need to buy a car, go out and get the employee pricing that's being offered now. A car will be more expensive in a year.
All right, Justin, same question to you. What's your advice for Americans who might be stressing out looking at their 401ks and bank accounts?
Look, none of us know which way the market's going to go. The one thing I do want to point out here is that what we've seen so far is not the end of it, which is at the moment markets are still pricing in some chance that Trump backs off. And so we've seen stocks fall 14%, even though we're not certain that he's going to stay the course. In terms of advice, the only thing that's obviously true is these are turbulent times, and if you don't have the stomach for risk, stay out of it. And beyond that, if you think you know what's going to happen, I tend to tell people to be a little more modest. It's very hard to time the market.
Let's get you caught up on the top story of the morning after U.S. stocks saw the biggest two-day wipeout in history as markets lose $11 trillion since Inauguration Day. That was Friday's news. They're now sinking lower before the opening bell for a third consecutive trading day in response to President Trump's tariffs. The president remains committed to his trade policies, writing on social media last night that they are a beautiful thing to behold. Last night on Air Force One, he was asked if about his tariffs and their impact on the markets.
We have to solve our trade deficit with China. We have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China. And unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal. Now, what's going to happen with the market, I can't tell you. But I can tell you our country has gotten a lot stronger. And eventually, it'll be a country like no other. It'll be the most dominant country economically in the world.
Is there pain in the market? At some point, you're unwilling to tolerate this idea of what Trump put. Is there a threshold?
I think your question is so stupid. I mean, I think it's I don't want anything to go down. But sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
You know, Zanny,
medicine.
I have... Again, it's voluntary.
If you're
but there's also,
sick, you take medicine.
Zanny, there's also something here, and we have a lot more to get to as far as just getting the news over the weekend. But I just want you to clarify something that's said there. When the president talks about trade deficits, it's one thing if you're talking about America's trade deficits with the EU, America's trade deficits with China. Okay, there's almost some equity there, but there are a lot of trade deficits. Say with Vietnam, we're always going to have trade deficits with Vietnam because Vietnam is going to make things more cheaply for us, and we're going to import things from Vietnam. We're not going to be exporting heavy machinery and a lot of advanced equipment to Vietnam along the same scale. So they're just naturally, because the United States is the global economic superpower, there's just going to be some countries where they're going to be trade deficits because they're going to make cheap things for people who live in Kansas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the notion that you should have a balanced trade with every single trading partner is completely economically illiterate. It's like saying that every company needs to have, exact reciprocal trade with every single one of its suppliers. It just doesn't make any sense for the reasons that you lay out. You can talk about the overall trade deficit of the U.S., which has a lot to do with how much Americans save and invest. But to talk about needing bilateral balance with every country, literally, that makes no sense.
I want to ask you, based on everything you've read over the weekend, everything you've heard from the president, everything you heard from the president's advisors, where do you think this is going? Obviously, this isn't just a simple example as, let's say, Bill Ackman and other people must have thought when they went all in with Donald Trump, where he's going to sort of flex his muscles rhetorically and then do a deal. But what's your best read, and what's the economist's best read on where we are right now, and how long this is going to be going before the president tries to strike those deals with other countries?
So I'm looking at two things. Firstly, I was struck by just how strongly he came out at the weekend. I mean, this was President Trump doubling down. But at the same time, if you see what's happening in markets, and I'm now beginning to look not just at markets tumbling, but panic selling. This is beginning to feel like 2008. Like, I'm worried about markets dysfunctionally melting down. If that happens, I wouldn't be surprised if the president declares victory but puts the implementation of those tariffs, which, remember, is coming in on Wednesday. He may put them on hold. I think the next 2 days are really crucial. If the markets continue to melt down, I think it's perfectly possible that he calls a hold. He'll declare it a victory. He'll say 50 countries want to negotiate. Everyone wants to negotiate. I'm going to give them time to negotiate. He'll be like the king giving, every one of his citizens a little bit of a break. But he may well do that, I think, if the markets continue to tumble.
All right. Over the weekend, a few Senate Republicans expressed concerns over President Trump's tariff plans as the stock market went into a tailspin. Senators shared their general support for the president's goals, but wondered aloud what it might mean for constituents and the overall economy.
But the stock market does matter. About 62% of Americans have money in the market. The wealth effect is real. There's reliable data that shows that for every $1 that the stock market or one's holdings in the stock market goes down, people spend 25 cents less. Well, we're a consumer-driven economy, and if people are spending less, that's going to affect your GDP. And so I'm not going to bubble wrap it. What's happening is not good. Now, will it continue? Will we find the bottom and then it'll start to go back up? I hope so.
Let's start with what's indisputable. America has been very generous in terms of offering access to our markets to our global competition. Some of our global trading partners have taken advantage of that. There are many products that are vital and strategic to America that we no longer produce. That's a national security risk. That should concern everybody. What President Trump is initiating here, this is a long-held belief that he believes that tariffs will correct those problems. But what's also indisputable is the markets are down about 8% in just 2 days, and I'm getting all kinds of reaction from businesses, farmers in Wisconsin that are highly concerned about what's happening. So those are the facts. I don't know, all I can really do is kind of report the reality to the administration, let them know, how these actions are impacting my constituents, and it'll be pretty much up to President Trump and his administration to determine exactly how long they're going to go down this road.
And I got to say, if we're in a scenario 30 days from now, 60 days from now, 90 days from now, with massive American tariffs and massive tariffs on American goods in every other country on earth, that is a terrible outcome. It's terrible for Texas, which obviously I care about deeply, and it's terrible for America. It will hurt jobs and hurt America. Number one, it would destroy jobs here at home and do real damage to the U.S. economy if we had tariffs everywhere. Number two, and this is a virtual certainty, inflation, this is going to have a powerful upward impact on inflation.